October 16, 1962, 8:45 in the morning. President John F. Kennedy is handed a manila envelope. Inside, a set of black and white photographs taken from 70,000 feet above the ground. He stares at them. His face doesn't change, but the men around him go pale, because those photographs show something that was never supposed to be there. Soviet nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from American soil. In that moment, without a single shot being fired, the world had already stepped to the edge of nuclear war. This is the story of 13 days that came closer to ending human civilization than anything before or since. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and most people still don't know how close it actually got. To understand how the world ended up here, we need to go back, not just months, years. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with fear, with proxy wars, with the silent threat of weapons so powerful one launch could trigger the end of everything. Both sides knew this. Both sides kept building anyway. By 1961, the tension had a face. Two faces, actually. John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, elected president at 43. He projected confidence, but behind closed doors, he was navigating a government full of generals who thought strength meant aggression. And Nikita Khrushchev, loud, unpredictable, a Soviet leader who had survived Stalin's purges and believed deeply that the Soviet Union deserved to be feared and respected. He had watched Kennedy stumble through the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Cuba's communist leader, Fidel Castro. And he drew a conclusion. Kennedy was weak. Kennedy could be pushed. That calculation would nearly end the world. Cuba itself was a spark. Castro had taken power in 1959, turning the island communist, just 90 miles off the Florida coast. The United States had tried to remove him and failed publicly, humiliatingly. Castro knew the Americans would try again, so he turned to the one country that both feared and courted him, the Soviet Union. Khrushchev saw an opportunity, a chess move disguised as an alliance. If Soviet missiles could be placed in Cuba, secretly, quietly, before anyone noticed, it would fundamentally change the balance of power. American missiles were already stationed in Turkey, aimed at the Soviet Union. This would simply return the favor. And more than that, it would prove something to the world, that the Soviet Union could project power anywhere. That Khrushchev was not afraid of Kennedy. The operation was called En Nadir, classified at the highest level. Soviet ships began crossing the Atlantic in the summer of 1962, carrying military equipment disguised under civilian cargo. Soldiers were told they were going somewhere cold. They were issued winter gear in the middle of a Cuban summer to keep them from guessing their destination. Thousands of Soviet military personnel landed on Cuban soil. Surface-to-air missile batteries went up first. Then came the medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 30 minutes. The Americans had suspicions. U.S. spy planes had been flying over Cuba for months, but cloud cover, political hesitation, and intelligence blind spots kept the full picture hidden until that morning in October, when the photographs made it impossible to deny. Kennedy now faced a decision that no president in history had ever faced, a decision where every option carried catastrophic risk. Military strike, the Soviets might launch in retaliation. Naval blockade, that might be seen as an act of war. Do nothing, unthinkable, politically impossible, personally intolerable. And here is the part that rarely gets told. Kennedy didn't trust his generals, his own military advisors, the most decorated, most experienced military minds in the United States were pushing for immediate airstrikes. Some were pushing for a full invasion of Cuba. They were confident. They were certain. They were also working with incomplete information that could have gotten millions of people killed. Because what Kennedy didn't know yet, what nobody on the American side knew, was that the Soviet submarines already circling in those waters were carrying nuclear torpedoes, and one of them was about to be ordered to fire. October 27, 1962, it would later be called Black Saturday, the single most dangerous day in recorded human history. But to understand how it got there, we need to follow those 13 days, one decision at a time. Kennedy assembled a secret group of advisors. They called themselves ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. 13 men in a room, suits and uniforms, maps and coffee cups. The fate of the planet balanced somewhere between them. For 6 days, they debated in secret. The American public had no idea. The world had no idea. While children went to school and families ate dinner, the most powerful men in the Western world were quietly trying to prevent nuclear war. Kennedy rejected the airstrike option, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he thought clearly about what came next. An airstrike might not destroy every missile. A surviving missile could be launched, and the moment one nuclear weapon was used, the logic of retaliation took over. Nobody wins. Nobody survives. He had read enough history to know how wars start. A single miscalculation, a moment of pride, a general who mistakes boldness for strategy. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television, calm, measured, and terrifying. He told the American people what had been hidden in Cuba. He announced a naval quarantine, a blockade, around the island. Any Soviet ship carrying military equipment would be stopped. He made clear that a nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The world stopped breathing. Soviet ships were already en route to Cuba, loaded with more military supplies, headed directly toward the American blockade line. In Moscow, Khrushchev was furious, publicly defiant. He called the blockade an act of piracy. He told his ships to keep moving. For 2 days, the world watched the Atlantic Ocean like it was a countdown clock. And then, the first twist. On October 24th, the Soviet ships slowed. Some stopped, some turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk leaned over to his colleague and said quietly, "We're eyeball to eyeball." And I think the other fellow just blinked. It felt like relief. It wasn't, because the missiles already in Cuba were still there, still being assembled. The CIA was reporting construction was accelerating, not stopping, and communications between Washington and Moscow were moving so slowly, through letters, through intermediaries, through back channels, that by the time one message was received and answered, the situation on the ground had already changed. This is the midpoint of the crisis, and this is where it gets terrifying in a way that no textbook properly captures. There were 3 moments during those 30 days when nuclear war almost started, not because of a decision made at the top, but because of events spiraling out of anyone's control. The first, an American U-2 spy plane accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia. A navigational error. Soviet fighter jets scrambled to intercept. American fighter jets scrambled to escort the U-2 home, and some of those fighters were carrying nuclear-armed missiles. For a brief window, armed aircraft from both superpowers were converging in the same airspace. Nobody had authorized this. Nobody could stop it in real time. The second, an American U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. It was the only combat death of the entire crisis. Kennedy's generals immediately demanded retaliation. Kennedy refused. He held, barely. The third, and this is the one that should haunt you, deep in the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 had lost contact with Moscow. It had been submerged for days. American destroyers had located it, were dropping depth charges not to destroy it, but to force it to surface. The American ships didn't know what the submarine was carrying. The submarine crew didn't know the depth charges weren't meant to kill them. The captain of B-59 believed war had already started. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. On a Soviet submarine in the middle of the Atlantic, in a vessel cut off from all outside communication, one man was about to make a decision that would have triggered a nuclear exchange between the world's two superpowers. The captain said yes. The political officer said yes. The third man, a senior officer named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. One man, one word. That is the only reason you are alive today, to watch this. Arkhipov argued that they had no confirmation of war. That firing without orders was not courage, it was suicide for the entire planet. He held his ground inside a metal tube 100 feet underwater, under pressure both literal and psychological that most of us will never comprehend. The torpedo was not fired. Back on the surface, the diplomatic race was reaching its breaking point. Khrushchev sent 2 letters to Kennedy in rapid succession, one offering a possible way out, the next harder and more demanding. Kennedy's advisors were confused. Which letter was the real position? Which one do you respond to? Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, suggested something unconventional. Ignore the harder letter entirely. Respond only to the first, as if the second one never existed. It was a gamble. It was also exactly right. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba. The crisis was over. Or, that's the version most people know. What most people are never told is what the deal actually cost. Quietly, secretly, away from cameras and headlines, the United States agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. The very missiles that had made Khrushchev feel encircled. The very missiles that had partly motivated this entire crisis. America got what it wanted publicly, but it gave something real in return and kept that part classified for decades. Because in geopolitics, the truth of what happened is often buried under the story of what was allowed to be seen. 13 days, 3 near launches, 1 submarine officer, 1 back channel deal. The world didn't survive the Cuban Missile Crisis because of strength alone. It survived because, at the most critical moments, a few individuals chose restraint over reflex, communication over confrontation, and the courage, the rare, underrated courage, to not pull the trigger. We live in a world that still has thousands of nuclear weapons. The technology is older now, but the logic hasn't changed. The The next crisis won't announce itself. It won't give anyone 13 days. So here is the question we're sitting with. If Vasily Arkhipov hadn't been on that submarine, if Kennedy had listened to his generals, if one letter had been misread, what version of this story would anyone have been left to tell?